It was 1485. The Battle of Bosworth had just been fought, and Richard III was dead. But for Margaret Beaufort, her efforts for the last few decades had finally come to fruition in the form of her son, Henry Tudor, who was now King Henry VII of England. But now came the question of whether he was able to hold on to it or not, and in this, Margaret would be instrumental. Although in the modern era there is often a neat divide for the Tudor era beginning, the truth is more complex. Richard III's reign had been short, Edward IV had been just before him, and even for the youngest adults, they would have remembered Henry VI's short second reign. There was every sceptical reason to assume Henry VII's reign would go the same way, and yet there was one major difference in Henry's favour. Most of his rivals were dead. Whether the House of York or Lancaster had been in charge over the decades, there had always been a rival waiting in the wings for their chance to pounce. But many had either died in the years before or had been killed at the Battle of Bosworth. It left very few, if anyone, who represented a real threat to Henry's crown, at least at first. Wasting no time, Henry immediately moved to secure his place, starting with the 10-year-old Edward Plantagenet, Earl of Warwick. Warwick's father was George, Duke of Clarence. When George was executed, his son could no longer inherit anything from him under an Act of Attainder. However, this was a technicality, and little Warwick could easily become a figurehead for the Yorkist cause. Henry placed Warwick in the Tower of London and placed his mother Margaret as the young boy's ward. Margaret herself came south to meet with Henry, who she hadn't seen for over 15 years. After what must have been an emotional reunion in London, the pair went to Margaret's home in Woking to reconnect and plan Henry's next moves. It's easy to see Margaret as nothing more than an overbearing mother in Henry's life, but in fact, she probably made his reign far easier than it would have been. As he had been away from England for so long, Henry had relied on his mother's letters, and the information from his fellow exiles could be useful, but would hold bias. Now he needed to know the complex web of relationships and alliances in England. Henry could trust only one person to be truly honest with him and knowledgeable about events, his mother, Margaret. And in doing this, she would carve out a unique place for herself as mother of the king. It is interesting that Margaret never considered herself for queen, but there hadn't yet been a female regnant on the throne, and so perhaps it never crossed her mind to claim the crown. For Henry VII, his claim was dual in nature. Through marrying Elizabeth of York, the Yorkist claim would be connected to him, but only while she lived. To bolster this, Henry needed to include his mother's claim from the House of Lancaster, as well as his own claim through conquest. Neither claim on its own was strong enough, but put together they could be. His coronation was lavish and filled with pomp. Margaret would proudly note the occasion in her Book of Hours, writing that, "On this day King Henry VII was crowned at Westminster. Crimson cloth of gold and ermine had been ordered to make luxurious clothes for the occasion, and the abbey was spectacularly decorated with symbols of the new king, Lancastrian red roses and Welsh dragons. And his uncle Jasper Tudor was given the honour of carrying St. Edward's crown. Margaret was reported to have wept tears when Henry was crowned, no doubt a mixture of pride and anxiety for what was to come. One of Henry's first actions was for the benefit of his mother. He had her declared a femme soleil, a woman who was able to act independently of her husband and own her own properties. For the first time in 4 marriages, the wealth that had been the lure for potential husbands finally became Margaret's alone. This was a right normally allowed only for queens or the occasional poorer woman who needed to run a business in her husband's absence. Margaret's entire life had been spent as a wife or mother, supporting the men around her, and now she was beholden to no one. In the style of Cecily Neville before her, Margaret took on the title of My Lady the King's Mother. By 1499, she had stopped signing documents as Margaret Richmond and instead signed simply as Margaret R. It has been debated as to whether this was simply a shortening of her name or instead the R was intended to stand for Regina, Queen, indicating her rise in status. These facts have often been quoted as proof that Margaret wanted to push for more power, but there is a simpler reason. After the many years of uncertainty and needing to place the safety of herself and Henry in the hands of others, it's likely Margaret simply wanted control over her own life. It's not something she could have necessarily expected, given the attitudes of the 15th century, but mother and son clearly understood each other. There was deep affection between them, as shown in one of Henry's letters to his mother, in which he tells her, "I shall be as glad to please you as your heart can desire it, and I know well that I am as much bounden to do so as any creature living for the great and singular motherly love and affection that it hath pleased you at all times to bear towards me." Thomas Stanley was created Earl of Derby and became known as Henry's beau-père, or the King's stepfather. While her land rights were hers alone, Margaret did ensure the money she gained from her lands was portioned up between herself and Thomas, showing their marriage truly was a partnership of equals where possible. Jasper Tudor became the Duke of Bedford and married Catherine Woodville, and John Wells, Margaret's half-brother, married Cecily Woodville. This was another moment for marriage to help heal ties between the houses of York and Lancaster. The attainders against Margaret, Henry and Jasper were all removed, and Elizabeth Woodville was also restored to her former comforts, which led to the next thing Henry had to do. If he still wanted to marry Elizabeth of York, he would have to remove the act denouncing her and her siblings as illegitimate. On the 7th of December, Parliament removed and destroyed the records of the title as Regius, and by the 10th, they asked Henry to unify two bloods by marrying Princess Elizabeth. They did this, however, while also carefully implying his claim was strong enough on its own and not on his wife's. Therefore, if Elizabeth died before Henry, his hold on the throne would not be in doubt. This was merely an end to the feud between the two houses. The other point of the marriage was also that it was assumed Elizabeth held the dominant claim for the House of York, not her brothers, remembering that no one was actually certain of their fate at this point. When Henry became king, he also took control of the Tower of London, and yet there is no record of what was or wasn't found there. If Henry had been uncertain of their deaths, the absence of the boys would almost certainly be announced in order to further smear Richard's name, and yet there was none. If there was no proof either way, announcing the princes as simply missing would probably have stirred up another war. The same logic could be applied to Elizabeth Woodville and her daughters, who may have hoped for some proof of the boys' true fate. On the 18th of January 1486, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York were finally wed, bringing their country the closest it had been for years to being healed from war. The response was jubilant, with people lighting bonfires across the kingdom, and London was filled with crowds of people singing and dancing. Francis Bacon would later sum up the mood by stating, "Bosworth had given Henry the bended knee of his subjects. This marriage gave him their hearts. It wasn't long after the royal couple announced that the Queen was pregnant with their first child. Poetry was written expressing the overwhelming joy and happiness across the land. Henry and Elizabeth's marriage also seems to have been one of genuine affection and love. They spent most of their time together, and Henry, for all of his later supposed miserly qualities, lavished his wife with gifts from expensive jewels to gold wire and cash. They always seemed to be harmonious together. Most people did seem happy with their new king and queen, but in Yorkshire there was a rebellion at Easter time, and Henry had to spend the first year of his reign showing himself around his new lands and putting down small-scale outbursts of violence. His new wife, her sisters, Elizabeth Woodville and Margaret Beaufort, all stayed together at St Swithin's Priory at Winchester for the summer. While there is no hard evidence for how all the women got along, it's highly likely there was competition between Elizabeth Woodville and Margaret. They were both intelligent, ambitious women who had fought for their place, and technically, as Dowager Queen, Elizabeth outranked Margaret. But while they may have jostled between each other, it's not to say they actively disliked one another. After all, they had happily worked together on arranging the marriage between their children and the downfall of Richard III. Not to mention, Margaret had known the Dowager Queen and her children for years during their time at court, and there is nothing to hint she was not fond of them. There is also a persistent rumour that Elizabeth of York and Margaret did not get along either, but the source of this is a single report from the Spanish ambassador in 1498, who stated that the king was led in all matters by his mother, and the Queen disliked it greatly. However, there is no other evidence for this, and there surely would have been had it been true. All other evidence actually points to cooperation between the two women, and this started with a series of measures put together to prepare for the first royal birth. Proper protocol was put in place to ensure Elizabeth was comfortable, that Winchester Cathedral would be suitably decked out for the christening, that the female members of the family were given prominent positions in the christening, and that after the child was born, a doctor should be present with the wet nurse to ensure the baby fed enough. On the 20th of September 1486, Elizabeth of York gave birth to the first royal child, a son. He was either a month early or, as was possible in the 15th century when a couple were betrothed publicly to be married, his parents may have cohabited briefly before their marriage. The child's birth was decked in Arthurian legends. In the 15th century, belief in King Arthur's existence was very real, and it was believed by many that Winchester was the site of his kingdom of Camelot. To add to this, the small boy was also named Arthur. There was an attempt to tie the new Tudor dynasty in with the legends of the heroic king who had united Britain. Elizabeth would go on to have 7 more pregnancies, but only 4 of her children would survive beyond early childhood. Little Arthur, as well as his younger brother Henry, and their 2 sisters, Margaret, no doubt named for Margaret Beaufort, and Mary. Everything seemed well. However, a few months earlier, a young boy named Lambert Simnel had caused an issue by claiming to be Richard of Shrewsbury, the younger of the princes in the Tower. But by the end of the year, he had changed his claim to that of Edward Plantagenet, Earl of Warwick. In a bid to calm things down, Henry even brought the real Earl of Warwick from the Tower of London and publicly paraded him through the capital's streets, but it didn't seem to persuade everyone. By June 1487, things had culminated in the Battle of Stoke Field, and finally, Lambert Simnel was brought before the king, and the rebel leaders either fled or were arrested or imprisoned. Henry VII recognised that the young boy wasn't the mastermind behind the revolt, and so he gave him a place in his royal household as a spit-turner. But during the time the young boy had claimed to be Prince Richard, all eyes had been on his supposed mother. The Dowager Queen never made any claims that it was true, and yet there seems to have been sufficient suspicion she might, to allow Parliament in February the following year to remove her properties from her. However, this could have been a simple matter of reorganisation, as those lands were given to her daughter Elizabeth, the new queen, who would take her income from them. Elizabeth Woodville was also given an annual pension of 400 marks and took up residence at Bermondsey Abbey on the Thames. This has often been used as proof that she was forced, possibly by Margaret herself, to retire from court. But it is difficult to be sure. Many widows of Elizabeth Woodville's age retired to a religious contemplative life, and the Abbey had connections with one of her ancestors, so she could stay at the royal apartments for free. It's also unlikely the young Queen Elizabeth would have been happy with her mother being so easily pushed aside. However, the timing suggests, at the very least, Elizabeth Woodville was encouraged to take up retirement plans perhaps earlier than she had planned. On the 25th of November 1487, somewhat later than it should have been, Westminster Abbey witnessed the grand coronation of Elizabeth of York as Queen Consort. She dressed in a white kirtle of cloth of gold, and her sister Cecily carried her long purple train trimmed with ermine. Her long blonde hair hung loose down her back in a symbol of virginity, this time signifying the virginity of queenship. Margaret Beaufort and Henry VII watched from a balcony covered with lattice, watching perhaps with a mixture of emotions. On the one hand, Elizabeth as Henry's wife and now as a queen consort added to his claim. On the other, it equally put it in danger. Around this time, Margaret was also given the wardship of two young boys, Edward Stafford, 3rd Duke of Buckingham, and Henry Stafford, 1st Earl of Wiltshire. They were brothers, and both sons of the same Henry Stafford who had been beheaded for rebelling against his former close friend Richard III. This was useful for the crown that the boys were put under the guardianship of a committed Lancastrian, and although this would probably have been something of an extra strain for Margaret, she cheerfully agreed, enabling the crown's happy state of affairs. Margaret also refused any monetary aid from her son, instead paying for everything for the two boys herself and occasionally giving them gifts. She also successfully brought them both up to be loyal to Henry VII. But trouble was just around the corner, and in 1490 a new pretender to the throne appeared. This was Perkin Warbeck, who claimed to be Richard of Shrewsbury. This time, he was aided by the only remaining member of the Yorkist royal family who had the money and means to help him, Margaret of York, the Duchess of Burgundy, who was sister to Edward IV and Richard III. It's highly unlikely Margaret of York actually believed his claims, but desperate to get Henry VII off the throne, she saw an opportunity. Perkin Warbeck was just believable enough. Many said he bore a strong resemblance to the young prince and the prince's father, and thanks to probably being coached by the Duchess, had perfect courtly manners and knew much about the royal family on an intimate basis. The Duchess of Burgundy's money helped pay for ships and men, and Warbeck soon made landings in England, which Henry had to deal with in kind. Facing defeat, Warbeck fled to Scotland, where he was warmly welcomed by King James IV of Scotland, who also married him to a noblewoman of his court, recognising the international influence he could leverage with his unusual visitor in Scotland. After once again reaching England to put up a fight, Warbeck surrendered in Hampshire in 1497 and was captured. Shortly afterwards, he retracted his claims, admitting only to being a Flemish man and an impostor. Henry's reaction to this was actually rather surprising. Rather than punish Warbeck, he released the young man from the Tower of London and even allowed him to appear at court. No doubt Margaret was nervous of these events, but 8 months later, Warbeck tried to escape and was put in the Tower of London once more, this time with Edward Plantagenet. The two tried once more for escape, but were captured and both executed. It seems convenient that not only was Perkin Warbeck now out of the way, but also the Earl of Warwick. Perkin Warbeck's escapades had cost the country £13,000. Margaret now threw herself into helping her daughter-in-law with her royal grandchildren. Both women wrote jointly to Isabella and Ferdinand of Spain about a marriage between their daughter, Catherine, and young Prince Arthur. The pair had been betrothed, but as with all political marriages, negotiations went on for many years. Both Margaret and Elizabeth were determined to help forge links between England and Spain against France, but equally they seem to have had a genuine desire to ensure Catherine would be well treated in their country. When Margaret Beaufort's granddaughter, Margaret Tudor, was betrothed to James IV, Margaret interceded with her daughter-in-law to Henry to ensure she was not sent to Scotland at too young an age, and so would not share the Countess of Richmond's fate. In 1499, Margaret once again took an unusual step towards her independence, and one that again points to her possible dislike of sexual relations when she took a vow of chastity. This was with her husband Thomas Stanley's permission, and she took the vow in the presence of the Bishop of London. This was unusual because she was not widowed, but it also possibly ties in with her devout nature. While the couple had always worked together to secure the safety and wealth of their family, neither had ever pretended it was a marriage of love. The relationship between them remained friendly and amicable, but Margaret now moved into her own property at Collie Weston, Northamptonshire, and was regularly visited by Thomas, who had his own rooms. In the lack of being able to hand regulation of justice in the Midlands and North to a sibling, Henry VII would turn to his mother, giving her the position instead from her new palace at Collie Weston. On the 14th of November 1501, Catherine of Aragon and Prince Arthur were married in a lavish ceremony. Margaret must have been elated to see the spectacle. It was the culmination of everything she had worked for, beyond it even. Not only was her son securely seated on the throne of England, not only had a union been created with Elizabeth of York, but now her charming grandson had married his future queen, creating ties with Spain. The young couple returned to Ludlow Castle, where they established their household, but sadly, the happiness and hope was not to last. Both Catherine and Arthur were struck with a severe illness that Catherine survived, and Arthur did not. He died on the 2nd of April 1502 at just 15 years old. His parents were devastated, and both were stricken with grief and mourned together, unusual for a royal family. But it must have been bittersweet for Elizabeth of York, who at 36 was once again pregnant. In 1503, she entered her confinement period as she had so many times before at the Tower of London. She gave birth on the 2nd of February 1503 to a baby girl, Catherine, who lived only a few days. Elizabeth herself succumbed to a postpartum infection and passed away just a few days later on the 11th of February, her 37th birthday. Her entire family were devastated. Elizabeth had been well loved, including by Margaret, who also deeply mourned the loss of her daughter-in-law, but none were as affected as King Henry. Her death broke his heart, and the king shut himself away, refusing to speak to anyone. His courtiers were alarmed by his behaviour, as Henry was normally a reserved character who showed little emotion, but he gave in to publicly sobbing and shouting after learning of his wife's death. He became ill and wouldn't allow anyone, including doctors, to come near him. There was only one person he would allow near him, the one person who he trusted above all others, his mother Margaret. Margaret moved into Richmond Palace, ordering medicines for her son and taking care of him. Henry was unusual for the time in that he had been a completely faithful husband to his wife with no mistresses, and although he made half-hearted gestures towards remarriage for the sake of his advisors, he would never remarry. As Margaret grew older, she was described as being devout to a degree we would today probably call fanatical. She would start at 5 a.m. each day with prayers and psalms, attend 4 or 5 masses a day on her knees before her morning meal, which was probably painful as she was also likely suffering from arthritis, attend evensong before dinner, and then go to her chapel for prayers before bed. However, she was also described as ruling her household with a rod of iron, and she wouldn't stand for any of her servants creating factions against the others. It's not surprising, after Margaret's life and considering her personality, that her need to control events and people around her came about. But she was also described as being kind, and if any of her household fell ill, it was Margaret herself who attended to them, and Margaret who was by their side if they died. In 1504, Margaret's final husband, Thomas Stanley, died. She took the opportunity to renew her chastity vows. No doubt she grieved for Stanley appropriately, but she could not pretend she had loved him deeply. It was also around this time that mother and son would have their only public disagreement. Margaret's most beloved property, arguably, was her home at Woking, but Henry rather liked it too and had designs on turning it into a royal property, instead offering his mother use of other properties. Margaret's thoughts in her later years turned to that of patronage, especially of Cambridge University. So much of her later years are better known precisely because her connection with the university ensured these records were preserved there. She took the underfunded school at Cambridge known as God's House and turned it into Christ's College, a college of the university that endures to this day. She also arranged for scholars there to have use of a country manor to stay in whenever plague was rampant in Cambridge. There is also a story of how she once looked out of the windows of the apartment she had reserved at the college and saw a dean punishing a scholar for being lazy. She cried out, "Lente, lente," meaning gently, gently. It is a suggestion to the kinder side of Margaret, one which she did not easily show after her hard life. Showing a softer character was dangerous, as it was often mistaken for weakness, as with her kinsman, Henry VI. But she was now also, in the years after Elizabeth of York's death, at least partially responsible for helping to bring up her grandson, Henry. Margaret was personally responsible for choosing many of the members of his household, and many of them came from her own. She also fulfilled the role of many grandparents throughout history to this day, of spoiling her grandson with presents, often gifting him with horses or religious books. By the spring of 1508, however, it was Henry VII who became ill with a fever. Margaret once again moved into Richmond Palace to attend to her son, nursing him back to a still fragile health. But he was too preoccupied by other matters to worry about getting better, especially when he had been in ill health several times in later years. In December 1508, he celebrated with the rest of his kingdom as the betrothal was announced of his daughter Princess Mary to Charles, the son of Philip, Duke of Burgundy, and Juana, Queen of Castile, a boy who would later become King of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor. But the marriage would never happen, Mary instead marrying King Louis XII of France. But the energy he poured into securing his daughter's future would be his last. By January of 1509, Henry was once again ill. Margaret, this time, moved her favourite bed and kitchen stuff along the Thames to settle at Richmond Palace for a longer stay, her own health now suffering. On the 21st of April, King Henry VII died. Margaret did not commit her private thoughts on her grief, but it cannot be doubted that it was a great personal loss. Most of her life had been dedicated to her son, and her letters proved that she loved him deeply. Losing a child while still living, no matter their age, must have been hard to bear. But ever practical, Margaret did not show it, instead following through on her son's wishes that she would be the executor of his affairs after his death. She had to arrange his funeral, while also ensuring the smooth succession of his heir, Prince Henry, now Henry VIII of England. Luckily, although technically there was still a minority, the new king would be of age in just a few weeks. Margaret ensured Henry VII's body, as he had wished, was laid beside his wife. It would seem young Henry VIII trusted his grandmother as easily as his father had done, and he took on her suggestions of Privy Council members and advisors. He gave her back her old manor of Woking, and Margaret settled there in retirement. It's not likely Margaret would have had as much influence over her grandson's court as she did her son's, however. Henry VII was grateful to his mother for what she had done, and when he arrived to take the crown, he was a relative stranger to England. Elizabeth of York and Margaret had built his royal appearance, court and council together. Henry VIII was different, and wouldn't have needed Margaret in the same way, however fond of her he may have been. Margaret was now 66 years old at this point, a very old age for the time period, and her ill health began to catch up with her. On the 29th of June, amazingly, just one day after Henry VIII turned 18 and reached the age of majority, Margaret died. She was buried in Westminster Abbey in the Henry VII chapel, which had been paid for out of her son's will, her elegant tomb created out of gilded bronze a year later. She was the last of the women to survive from the Wars of the Roses. With her death was the snapping of a final thread that held England's memory to that bloody and ruthless time. But Margaret had conquered everything set in her way. She had survived a teenage pregnancy in which she had to travel through winter snow to the safety of her brother-in-law's castle. She had helped her son stay alive by switching allegiances when necessary, and had survived war after successive war between two noble houses. Margaret had fought to retain her son's title and fortune, even at the risk of her own life. She had lived through 5 monarchs, and her crowning achievement was that the last 2 were her own son and grandson, something young Margaret could not have foreseen. While she was devout, Margaret was no saint, but neither was she a monster. She was a survivor and a mother. And in these roles, Margaret Beaufort established a dynasty that both ended the Wars of the Roses for good and started a new conflict based on religion, the Tudors. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.